Archiving started.
Hello everyone, this will be an audio lecture on the concept of values education. Values education is also connected to the idea of citizenship education. But let's look at values education first. A major goal of social studies instruction is the development of an enlightened citizen, which is above all the promotion of social responsibility. Therefore, it is important to understand how values and ethics education are treated in research. While scholars agree on the importance of values and ethics in social studies instruction, there is less agreement on how we should define and teach this area of study. Of even more concern is the role of academic areas such as history and economics in teaching values. Can we as educators, as history teachers, teach history without teaching values? Without values, is economics only a poorly conceived mathematics program? If we say that academic areas and values are tied to one another, then whose values are we teaching? If we argue that values in academic areas are separate categories of knowledge, then what knowledge or information should we present to students? Should we teach philosophy, religion, literature? Given these kinds of questions, it is important for social studies teachers to develop a sound rationale for teaching values and become familiar with alternative instructional approaches. So as we look at those goals, let's now turn there. We start with the premise, teaching values is unavoidable. Paraphrasing other researchers, we might say, I can't hear a word you're always saying for what you are you're speaking too loudly. A teacher's actions, dress, language, class activities, testing procedures, content selection, and general outlook on life all reflect and teach values to students. Yet as educators, we seem to pay little attention to why, what, and how we teach values. All of us know people who would argue that values should be taught at home or in church or even in the community, but not in school. Others say values cannot be taught anyway, so we should not waste time with them. Let's look at a definition of what we would look at as values. In trying to define values and values education, it is important to distinguish among several terms. Values is an inclusive concept encompassing both attitudes and beliefs. Attitudes are emotions or affective leanings towards people, places, events, and ideas. They are often unexamined. For example, an attitude towards jazz music may be positive or negative, with no clear rationale for such a position. Beliefs, on the other hand, tend to be more cognitive in nature, suggesting preferences based upon evidence. The evidence needed not be factual, only creditable to those whom we respect, such as authorities, parents, and peers. For example, one may believe that jazz is wonderful music, not necessarily from listening to jazz itself, but from the respect of an individual who likes jazz. If we value jazz, this means we have an emotional leaning, an attitude towards it, as well as a belief that jazz is a worthy musical form. Thus, values contain both beliefs and attitudes, and are more deeply held than either. Values are also more resistant to change. What do values do in our life? They create criteria necessary for moral decisions and actions, such as honesty in all of our human interactions, a description used to classify particular actions or attitudes. Also, an intrinsic awareness, purpose, or meaning, such as a deep faith in God and an inner strength. One of the most enduring arguments in the field of values education is whether values, concepts, and factual concepts are similar. This argument stems from a desire to stop forming rigid categories or distinctions between facts, judgments, and value judgments. On the other side of the issue, there are those who suggest that values are conceptually different from facts and claim there is no fact-values continuum. Look at some types of values. Another way to teach about values and values education is to consider the different types of values that appear. For example, values can be instrumental or terminal. Instrumental values are behaviors such as courage, rationality, or honesty that can help achieve terminal values such as wisdom, self-respect, and world peace. In other words, instructional values are means and terminal values are ends. Once a person internalizes a value, it becomes a standard for acting as well as evaluating the action of others. This placing of values in categories is useful when considering the relationship and consistency between ends and means in any personal or public policy discussion. For example, the terminal, as we discussed briefly, the end value of winning among athletes is often at odds with the instrumental value of fair play. So looking at that one concept, the end value or the terminal value of winning conflicts with the instructional value or the one that you're developing as you go, fair play. Values can also be personal or social. Here again, the difference between personal and group values tends to overlap in that individual members share the values of the group. This classification of values can be useful when discussing issues such as gun control, environmental protection laws, abortion, and so forth. Do all people who favor environmental protection laws as an end accept the same means to achieve that end? I like that. That's terminal and instructional. Values can be behavior or substantive in nature. Behavioral or procedural values are much like those discussed in the ways that are necessary conditions to achieving other ends. For example, respect for other people is not only a desired end state for a citizen, but also a behavior value necessary for a democratic end state for a citizen. So we have two major types of values: instrumental in terms, personal, and social. And if we add a third category of behavioral, which is action, and substantive, which is reflective. As you see, there are several types of values. You should remember that in social studies, one of our major goals is to help students define their values. And values are the criteria we use in making judgments about behaviors, ideas, and events. The development of values in all of us is an ongoing process that helps us analyze, evaluate, and make consistent decisions. So now at this point, we have a better understanding of what values are and how they are multiple level. So now let's look at what value education is. School is a moral enterprise, for its influences and controls human behavior and the general direction of social evolution. Therefore, differences and controversies among groups with different points of views will be inevitable. Many educators believe that they should remain neutral in this debate. However, from which issues would you like to be excused? For example, should the United States support nuclear war? Should we institute a negative income tax? Would you categorize those as value education issues? If they are values issues, or if they suggest different should you discuss in a social studies classroom? Teachers may be caught between two choices. One, on one side, they can try to remain neutral and just refuse to deal with values in any way. This position is based upon the notion of value-free social studies that some social scientists hold to be true. We believe this position, and I believe this position, is untenable. On the other side, teachers can help students explore historical and contemporary issues in ways that will illuminate value, definitions, conflicts, and decisions. A question you should ask, being in this class, is, why should I teach values? The position I take as instructor is that teaching values is unavoidable. By definition, teaching is a value-laden craft. Thus, we should try to develop a definition as well as a historical context for values education. I guess perhaps the best way to understand values education is to see it first within the historical context of the 20th century. As the tide of immigrants in the early part of the century arrived in the New World, as World War I altered previous held notions of personal and social responsibilities, and as the Roaring Twenties presented new threats to social stability, virtually every school in the United States became involved in developing the character of students through programs that we would classify as values education. However, many researchers found after evaluating the effectiveness of their programs that the results were disappointing. Primarily because of the overpowering social upheavals of depression and war, values education subsided from the 30s through the 50s. However, in the 60s, it seemed to many that the core values of society were in trouble. Social problems, including drug abuse, a more permissive attitude towards sexual conduct, increased suicide, the Vietnam War, and other trends and events led many to believe that the schools need to deal with values. Add to this declining academic performance and the poor character models of people in leadership positions in sports, politics, and business, and citizens turned again to the schools. In early years of the century, schools tried to respond to a real social need, and that is the need of value education. In 1966, two influential publications that changed the direction of values education were published: Values in Teaching and Moral Education in Schools by Coburg, 1966. These two approaches would dominate values education for the next 20 years. Now, one idea is the idea of cooperative learning. So let's look at the concept of cooperative learning. Cooperative learning strategies place students in a small group learning situations. The achievement of the group assumes importance, and students take responsibility not only for their own learning, but also for that of other group members. This type of learning environment results in positive social values and behaviors. If you look at Eric and EBSCOhost and you look at the literature on cooperative learning, you'll notice that all the research indicates that in addition to improving academic achievement, students also develop positive social attitudes. They learn to get along better with people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. They accept mainstreaming of students, and they show greater concern for the welfare of others. Cooperative learning strategies seem to hold great promise for social studies classroom organization. Community study or social action programs involve community service activities that students perform in their school as well or their community. Activities range from helping the elderly to actively participating in social legislation aimed at changing some condition in the school or community. Because of the difficulty in doing research in these various stages, there's not much out there. But think of projects that a social studies teacher could do, such as yourself, in a school that could help build the community. Let's look at history and values, and history and the social sciences. While some schools and courses like civics and contemporary issues are interdisciplinary, most social study courses are discrete classes in history or one of the social science disciplines. This means that the study of values, the education, the character of students, and the nature of the classroom setting are, for the most part, handled within history and social science classrooms. So what is the connection between history, which all of you think that you are history teachers, and values? History may be defined as a way to identify the roots of present values by studying narratives from the past. History is contemporary in the sense that we interpret it in the present by linking the present with the past. History is always colored and illuminated by the worldview of the reader because you're interpreting it in the present. History, because of its use of the narrative form that we see in our books, provides an excellent way of studying values. The stories of people, the stories that we call history, can emphasize kings, wars, and the exploits of the rich, white, middle to upper class men. Or history can tell the stories about minorities, women, and the ordinary people. History can tell the progress or injustice of common high purpose or oppression. The social studies teacher should understand that history operates at a number of different levels. Like any story or narrative, there are values of the author, the reader, and the social setting. When we address these values, we have a better chance of making history meaningful to our lives. Now you see a very good assignment that may be emerging, and I'll go ahead and write this down because if you're listening to this, then you should be into this idea of values. A really good assignment would be to find a historical story that can teach value education. The narrative form of explanation can provide the link between history and the studies of values. History is universal in that all people tell stories of their heritage. And because these stories are based on value structures, they enable us to understand a particular worldview. History is basic to the concept of values because it portrays the human being as one who generates and uses values to explain the past. Thus, to understand history, we must also understand the relationship between people and their value structures. For example, if a culture values individualism, courage, and conflict, their history emphasizes these events of people and ideas that help citizens develop their values. This might be done through stories of war, heroes, the Western frontier, the Civil Rights Movement, and grand events like space exploration. Immigrants to some culture who have not developed this value structure have some trouble understanding the significance of these stories. Values within social sciences are not so much defined as they are charted. That is, how do values change and why? Let's look at some approaches to value education. There are many ways to classify values in values education, including moral reasoning, value advocacy, and value analysis. Let's look at three things that should be clear no matter how you eventually come to understand these approaches. First, these approaches are not mutually exclusive. It means they're not the only one you can do. Second, they have advocates who like them and who don't like them. And third, it's difficult to determine the effectiveness of these approaches in each one of your classrooms. Let's look at one of the approaches. Value advocacy is perhaps the most universal and pervasive way in which we teach values. Value advocacy. Every teacher, indeed every person, advocates certain values. All educational systems indoctrinate the oncoming generation with basic outlooks and values of the political order. Value advocacy embodies the idea of direct cultural transmission from adults to citizens. All teachers are advocates in that you emphasize certain values or approaches over others. That is, you as a future teacher or current teacher will stress procedure, instrumental or terminal values like justice, happiness, honesty, being punctual. So in the final analysis, all approaches either implied or explied is everyone advocates values. We always want to have values. Value advocacy is the learning strategy that inspires, persuades, moralizes, and otherwise convinces students to adopt the right values. Thus, there is no need to develop decision-making skills because choices are already made for the student. This approach are example setters, and you should always be an example setter. And they should present right values that the community has outlined. Of course, there are critics to this approach of demonstrating key values. Critics of the value advocacy approach charge that engaging students in this approach leads to disillusionment and antisocial attitudes like bigotry, ethnocentrism, and cynicism. These attitudes occur when students have little opportunity to reflect upon the real ideal dilemmas of life. For example, one of the beliefs of our republic is that all people are created equal. However, as students look around the real world, they see that people are not treated as equal. How do principles like those that are stated in the major documents of our republic square with the facts of life in the United States? Critics of value advocacy express concern that teachers will expose students to only one side of the real ideal dilemma. And this was the idea is that teachers can impart certain values to students that reflect the social theories. So that's the idea of value advocacy. That's one of our approaches to value education. So you see that value education is multi-level. The second one is moral reasoning. Moral reasoning uses moral dilemmas in history and contemporary settings to encourage students to make decisions. When I was a child, you'd buy these books, and they were like story books, and when you got like through 10 pages, like Jack ran up a hill, or you're in a cave. Do you go right or left? And then you have to, if you choose to go, flip to page 4. If you choose to go left, choose page 30. So it was kind of like a pick your own way book. I think they still make them. Those are kind of good. That's kind of like moral reasoning. The central rationale of the approach is that students can enhance their moral reasoning abilities through properly led discussions of moral and ethical problems. The moral reasoning approach is based on the research of Harvard psychologist Kohlberg and his associates. This approach suggests a developmental process whereby students move up through various stages of moral reasoning. The students can achieve this progression through maturity and through intellectual practice with moral dilemmas. They create 3 different levels. One is called the pre-conventional level. People base moral judgments on the power of authority figures, or the consequences of an individual's actions. That is, will I be rewarded or punished for my behavior? People base stage 1 behavior on the avoidance of punishment or the opportunity to earn rewards. At the conventional level, people base moral judgments on loyalty to others. Loyalty to family, friends, school, church, and nation takes priority over simple personal needs such as level 1 of reward and punishment. Individuals will work to maintain and justify the existence of the status quo. In the final and third stage, the post-conventional level of moral reasoning, people value principles that go beyond the authority of the group. The individual seeks to do what is right in accordance with universal values and principles. He or she is concerned with high purpose, with transcendency, the individual and the group. Within this level, stage 5 decisions reflect the legal point of view. Therefore, right behavior is that which adheres to the rights and responsibilities upon which the society has agreed. Further, there is a tolerance within the stage to change laws and rules. An individual's conscience guides moral reasoning. If the law is not right, in their conscience, they fight to change it. So with moral reasoning, you go from each stage to the top. When we apply moral reasoning to the classroom, we ask students to confront moral dilemmas from either history or contemporary life through discussion, analysis, and logical reasoning. An example of this would be Braveheart. The movie Braveheart followed a man named William Wallace. William Wallace was a very tough man. And he was, what would you do in that situation? Would you kill English soldiers and lead a revolution if English soldiers were harming your people? Another moral dilemma is the famous Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who led a revolt in Rome. Now, if you watch the movie from the 50s and the 60s, it's not the same. What really happened in Spartacus was Spartacus led a revolt and kind of he kept his little rebel army roaming around Italy, and it lasted several years. And what finally ended up happening was he actually had an opportunity to escape. He could have escaped out of the top of Italy, but he decided not to. And he stayed in Italy, and they kept doing their little revolution, and they would move from place to place over the years. Well, finally, the Romans got tired of them and sent some armies after them, and they faced off. And Spartacus was faced off against the Roman army, and he captured a Roman soldier. And there he was, faced off against the Roman army, and he had captured a Roman soldier. And Spartacus knew that the Romans could defeat him in open battle. They could. He had a chance to win, though. But what he decided to do was, he was also afraid his men would leave and abandon him. After all, he was fighting with a slave army, an army that the Romans would just take back into slavery if they captured. So he decided to do something to keep his men from leaving him. What would you do to keep your men from leaving you? What he decided to do was he decided to crucify the Roman soldier he had captured in front of his army and also in front of the Roman army. What this meant was that when the Romans saw this, they became outraged. And they knew if they captured any of the slaves, they would crucify all of them. So he kind of sold out his army to keep his army together. Ultimately, what would happen would be he would continue fighting, and eventually his army would get captured, and the Romans would line the streets of Rome with the crucifixions of slaves. But he did keep his army from folding. That would be an example of moral reasoning. What would you do as a student if you were Spartacus? If you knew if you were captured, you would be crucified. But your army may leave you. Would you sell out your army to keep them together? and the hopes of winning. The third one would be value description. So we've looked at moral reasoning. We looked at value advocacy. Value advocacy is where the teacher says, let's do this, let's do that. Let's, lead by example. Moral reasoning is more of the idea of making the students think and move up the levels. Value description focuses upon defining value concepts, developing generalizations, and building theories so that we can better understand the role of values in personal and public decision making. We can describe the approach more of a scientific approach in an attempt to describe reality based on observations. The most common use of this is in survey research and observations of the habits of people. The primary concern is with the state of reality as it appears rather than dealing with notions of what ought to be. Personal and societal values are identified, studied, and defined. So as you see, value education is something that is very important to all of us. And value education can be approached in different ways. And we teach it no matter if we try or we don't. So at the conclusion of this lecture, we see the idea of value education. My next lecture will be citizenship education and making good citizens. So listen for that one. Thank you for listening.